Hello and welcome. You know, we feel like how we begin a festival and how we end a festival are two really, really big markers. And this is our 10th anniversary, and we have literally, there's a whole group of us, and we have worked so hard to keep our festivals free and open to all. And so it is a particular sort of happiness that we get to end with our wonderful Jim Sulzer. So it really is a great privilege and an honor to be introducing Jim Sulzer, as he is one of ours. A beloved teacher on island for decades, he joined our efforts at the Nantucket Book Foundation to enlarge our students' worlds through the power of words. We created the Young Writer Award, an essay competition to both encourage and honor our students' courage in putting their stories on the page. Jim has dedicated his time and talent with us as being one of our judges since our very beginnings. Of course, his time and talent has also been dedicated to his writing. I was first introduced to his writing talent through his series of mystery novels for middle school readers, bringing us The Card People. Next came Nantucket Daybreak, a novel written as only an islander could, particularly this islander who was also a scallop fisherman. I know, a man of many talents. Clearly, though, this writer has a poet's soul. Jim's next two novels take a fictive leap through the lens of poets Emily Dickinson and John Keats. Please join me in giving our author-writer Jim Sulzer a really warm welcome.
Thank you. The hardest part of this, I'm supposed to raise this. Thank you, Mary, and thank you for all you're doing to bring fabulous authors to our island and also to foster the writing of young people here. Why John Keats? What is it about this author who died so young at age 25? Whose lines of verse continue to touch readers around the world with their rich beauty and profound sense of life and death. Immortal lines such as, "Then glut thy sorrow on a morning rose, or on the rainbow of the salt sand wave." I'll give one example of the enduring effect of this poet 201 years after his death. Late last fall, I received a note from a delightful couple, Dave and Beth, who are fans of John Keats. But the biggest fan of all is her 92-year-old father, Luther, who lives in South Carolina and has lost most of his vision. They told me they were making a recording of Writ in Water for Luther, with Dave reading the parts narrated by John Keats, and Beth reading the sections told by the other narrator, the Nightingale. And they asked me to record a message for Luther, which of course I did with great pleasure. When I last heard from Beth and Dave in January, Luther had already listened to the entire book twice, and he and I soon had a phone call in which he talked at length about his love for Keats, age 92. All of this is typical of the loyalty that John Keats inspires in his readers, and that leads to the next question. Why a novel about this poet, and how did I go about it? The short answer, because his life is about finding beauty and meaning against a background of suffering and loss, while at the same time dealing with his own character traits, strengths and flaws. Now, the longer answer. I first came upon John Keats as a freshman in college when a friend read aloud Ode to a Nightingale. It begins with the beguiling lines, "My heart aches and a drowsy numbness pains my sense, as though of hemlock I had drunk." I was struck by the poem's beautiful and sensuous language, and I had no idea what it meant. True. Later that year, I found a book of Keats's collected writing, and it was his letters that captured me, full of wit and smart turns of phrase. How could you not respond to his last known letter, which he sent from Rome to his friend Charles Brown, Keats ends it with this phrase, "I always made an awkward bow." I always made an awkward bow. In 6 words, Keats communicates so much understanding of parting and irony and rueful self-knowledge. This poet was clearly someone worth getting to know. Though composed in his early 20s, Keats' letters show astonishing wisdom and insight. At the age of 23, in describing Shakespeare's greatness, he coined one of the most famous phrases in English literature, negative capability, by which he meant an artist who is, quote, capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. And of course, when Keats wrote this, he was completely unknown and was basically completely unknown at his death, almost. Keats also explored the deeper implications of our pains and troubles here on earth. From a letter he wrote to his brother George in 1819, almost a personal philosophy. He wrote, "Call the world, if you please, the vale of soul-making. Then you will find out the use of the world. I say soul-making, soul as distinguished from an intelligence. There may be intelligences or sparks of the divinity in millions, but they are not souls till they acquire identities. How then are souls to be made? How but by the medium of a world like this? Do you not see how necessary a world of pains and troubles is to school an intelligence and make it a soul? A place where the heart must feel and suffer in 1,000 diverse ways. As various as the lives of men are, so various become their souls, and thus does God make individual beings souls of the sparks of his own essence." But of course, first and foremost with Keats is the poetry. His 6 odes are unrivaled, Ode to a Nightingale, Ode on a Grecian Urn, and others. My favorite is To Autumn. What better description of autumn could there be than Keats' lovely opening line, "Season of mists and mellow fruitfulness." And what more beautiful close than this stanza? "Where are the songs of spring? Aye, where are they? Think not of them, thou hast thy music too. While barred clouds bloom the soft dying day, and touch the stubble plains with rosy hue, then in a wailful choir the small gnats mourn among the river sallows, borne aloft or sinking as the light wind lives or dies. And full-grown lambs loud bleat from hilly bourne, hedge crickets sing, and now with treble soft, the redbreast whistles from a garden croft, and gathering swallows twitter in the skies." When I read Keats in college, I recall my professor pointing out that gathering swallows paints a moving picture, eternally in the present tense, the perfect end to this celebration of autumn out of time. But not just a celebration, it's deepened by other shades, hints of the process of maturing and dying, full-grown lambs, wailful choir, sinking, light wind lives or dies. And the music of it is beautiful too. And full-grown lambs loud bleat from hilly bourne, the L's and the B's in that line. That's typical of Keats, just throwaway, beautiful melody. In fact, there's a recent quote I read from Borges, the South American writer, that he first decided to become a writer when I think his grandfather read to him Ode to a Nightingale in English. Borges did not understand English. He heard the sound of the words and decided at that point, I will be a writer. Think of that. This poet knew beauty, but he also knew pain and sorrow. They're all of one piece in his world and in ours as well. John Keats departed the world on February 23rd, 1821, at the tender age, we know, of 25, having left behind a legacy of beauty and suffering, tremendous suffering. Keats' father died when he was 8, his mother when he was 14. She died of consumption, tuberculosis, as would Keats' brother Tom, whom John cared for, and as would John Keats himself after a short life marked by poverty and want. His poverty was in large part the result of the greed and dishonesty of Richard Abbey, the untrustworthy trustee of the Keats family estate. So there we are. The poetry is in our possession. And we have some fine biographies, a number of which I've read, of course, and you may have as well. Why then the need for a novel about our poet? My original goal was to render a series of fictional scenes that would distill the essence of Keats's life. The character John Keats would reside within the known framework of Keats's life, loving the vivacious and clever Fanny Brawne, fearing and distrusting Richard Abbey, caring for his brother Tom as he grew ill with consumption. I wasn't looking for just a literal recreation. I wanted to capture something else, the Keats aesthetic. The language of the novel, though written in the idiom of today, would be subject to the gravity of Keats's genius with words. Sentences would bend and curve in the direction of Keats's way with words, at times picking up his cadences and rhythms. The character of Keats would be both himself and something more, the embodiment of a spiritual and artistic presence. This was an ambitious goal. I was young then, only 63 or 64. And it eluded me for years, despite a whole lot of effort. I spent a year in reading and research, including several trips to Keats's haunts, which I'll describe a bit later, and then a year writing a draft of about 500 pages, complete with a present-day framing story. After getting some feedback from friends, I scrapped much of that draft and wrote a new version of about 250 pages with a whole new framing present-day story. Then 4 years in, at the urging of my editor, I scrapped most of that too. What was compelling about Keats's life story, she asked. Why do you want to tell it? Why does the reader need to read it? The answer to these questions lay in Keats's early death. While still a little known or respected poet, his short life had left behind a number of unresolved pieces. Because of his genius, he had accomplished unthinkably great things, but he didn't know it, not completely. His letters betray incredible confidence in his gifts, but also deep doubts about his real accomplishments. In the realm of poetry, he felt he had to write an epic to prove his greatness, a long poem to prove his greatness. And he knew his longest poem, Endymion, was terribly flawed, a leap headlong into the sea, as he termed it, and it was, pretty much. 4 years into this project, I recast this book entirely, choosing the moment of Keats's death as the starting point. I wasn't exactly sure how it would go, but I knew that the spirit of John Keats would need to encounter, to use a Dickens-like metaphor, the ghosts of his unfinished life. What were those unresolved pieces? The aristocratic critics who savaged his work and called him a Cockney poet. His love for Fanny Brawne, with whom he had an ecstatic but troubled relationship. Richard Abbey, the cruel trustee of the family estate. His brother Tom, who died under his watch. The artist Benjamin Haydon, who claimed Keats had misled him about a loan. And his sister, also named Fanny, forced to live with the family of Richard Abbey and neglected at times by John. By now I knew a number of favorite Keats lines by heart, and the new draft opened with one of them, "Nothing ever becomes real till it is experienced." Keats, "Nothing ever becomes real till it is experienced." It's from another letter to his brother George. In the new draft, Keats is at the moment of death, drifting somewhere above the Spanish steps in Rome. He'd been sent to Rome by friends a few months earlier in the hopes that the warmer winter would prolong his life. This novel was now told in the first person in the voice of John Keats. I hadn't written more than 8 or 10 pages before another voice intruded, a second narrator taking its place in the story, really uninvited. This was a voice from outside Keats, an observer, a voice full of naivete and gentle wisdom. Puzzled but fascinated by what it saw. I soon realized that it was the Nightingale from Keats's famous ode, now in spirit form itself. This was a surprise, and it would require some working out, both the rhythm of the two voices as they took turns telling the story, and the ongoing relationship between the two characters. Slowly, over the next year and a half, all of this sort of worked itself out. When it was important to see a memory from the inside, Keats narrated. when it was better to present the scene from the outside and allow the reader to take clues from the surface, the Nightingale narrated. The Nightingale offered the crucial perspective of an outsider, someone trying to understand this strange world of humans. And there was another benefit. In trying to see the world through the Nightingale's eyes, I became a better writer. Though I've always thought of a crescent moon as a fragment of a hoop, the Nightingale saw it as something quite different, a clenched talon. This is from a passage when the Nightingale tries to explain Keats's love of poetry. The beauty he found and set in his verse was precious to him, like those bits of nature where I drew inspiration for my songs, a patch of blue on a still pond, a sliver of moon clenched like a talon in the afternoon sky, the thrum of my mate's wings when she returned to our nest. I had to consider, how would a nightingale see a painting on a wall? My editor asked me to do this. Here is, and she was a tough editor, here is its description of Benjamin Haydon's famous painting, Christ's Entry into Jerusalem. So the Nightingale says, high on the wall behind the table shone a bearded man in a white robe, astride a donkey that didn't move, surrounded by a crowd of men who didn't move, including one who looked like the poet. The wall had captured them as a pool of water captures a tree that soars into the sky above its still surface. In making this leap to look through the eyes of the Nightingale, I felt my mind making a leap of its own. Images came more easily and economically. There was a complex dynamic. I knew, of course, that I was the one writing the words, but it felt as if the Nightingale were doing the work. In one passage, the spirit of Keats's sister comes to him for a final parting. How to describe the nighttime scene? Here's how the Nightingale recounts the final moments. The light around the bed grew still and cold, like moonlight frosting a wisp of cloud, and the bed and the girl dissolved into the darkness. At different times I've tried, but never been able to describe that spectral light when a scrim of cloud drifts in front of the moon. The Nightingale found a way, frosting. I also gained economy and focus in writing the sections narrated by Keats, and that was largely because of my because of my editor, who never let me off the hook. And after 6 years, the novel was finished. The story of John Keats is resolved by what seems at first a minor event in his life, a small act of kindness. The impulse of a moment, too quick for conscious planning, the kind of act that reveals the true nature of a soul. That short episode is designed so that it, in turn, opens like a magic door back onto two major events in Keats's life, the presence of the Nightingale and his meeting with Fanny Brawne. The circle felt complete. Before we take questions, I'd like to read a few passages from the book. And I'm going to start by saying that I mentioned that Barbara and I took some trips over to see the haunts of John Keats. In the summer of 2015, one of our nieces was getting married in England, in Oxford, and so we took a week before and went up to the Lake District and went for a walking hike across that incredibly beautiful area, which is really the haunts of William Wordsworth, of course, but Keats went up there on a hike with his friend Charles Brown, hoping to learn poetry. He thought he would learn poetry there. And he wanted to see Wordsworth, whom he adored, and later soured on, but anyway, he couldn't find Wordsworth. But Barbara and I ended up starting our hike on basically the same day in the end of June, like June 24th, that Keats had started on it, like, I don't know, 195 years earlier. But anyway, so that week of walking turned into one paragraph in the novel, which I will read. This is narrated by John Keats. The vistas are more varied and spacious and lovely than I imagined, than I could possibly have imagined. Immense silver lakes flood to the rim of the distant horizon, shimmering beneath a stately succession of sun and shadow. Brilliant green fields, dotted with dark-faced herdwick sheep, lift and fall in swells and folds and meet in charming angles at rugged stone walls. Pale sage mountains rise in stunning vertical sweeps, crack open into deep chasms and flinty cliffs, and soar off into the clouds. A beauty of a more humble kind spreads itself at our feet. Ferns festoon the forest floors with tangled exuberance. A flower known as foxglove grows everywhere, tall glowing torches of purple or yellow, flourishing beside the paths, even taking root in outcroppings of slate. Fog and mist descend in a moment from nowhere and wrap the muted world in a blanket of silken mystery. I write to Tom that the tone, the coloring, the slate, the moss, the rockweed all astonish me. The place has an intellect, a countenance all its own. Here I know I shall learn poetry. So that's the Lake District as seen through the eyes of John Keats, as seen through my eyes. I wanted to read you a little bit with Richard Abbey, the untrustworthy trustee, and Fanny, not Fanny Braun, but Fanny Keats, John's younger sister, who after the death of their mother had to live with the Abbeys, which was not at all a happy situation. So here's a little scene when John has come back to get her to come visit Tom, who's dying of consumption. And also he's just had a book, Endymion, come out. He gives a copy of it to Fanny, and Richard Abbey greets him with customary kindness. Okay, so he and Fanny are laughing. Actually, this joke is from a historically documented moment, which is Mrs. Abbey has seen Fanny Keats run quickly across to see John, and this is, somebody recorded this quote, "I never thought I'd see a Keats move so quickly across the room." And then Fanny whispered to John, again this is documented, "Well, if it's born in us, how can we help it?" I coughed to hide my laughter. "And what is it that we find so amusing?" Mr. Abbey asks. "It's nothing," I reply, taking Fanny's hand and swinging it back and forth. "Nothing? Nothing. Nothing. How fitting that you use that word," Abbey observes. I raise my head and give him an inquiring look. "It reminds me of something I read recently, a book of poetry," he snickers. "Would you care to explain what you mean?" I find myself forced to ask. An expression ripples across his face. It's another historical quote. "Well, John, I have read your book, and it reminds me of the Quaker's horse, which was hard to catch and good for nothing when he was caught. So your book is hard to understand and good for nothing when it is understood." Fanny makes a little sound like a trapped animal. "How dare you," she cries. "How dare you insult John so?" "That's more than enough from you, young lady." Mrs. Abbey wrenches her away so abruptly that Fanny has no time to put up any resistance. "Back to bed with you," she commands. With sinewy strength, she drags Fanny out the door to the stairwell as the stunned girl clutches the book to her chest. Fanny's voice, half muffled, calls from behind the door, "Don't listen to them, John!" Abbey spreads his hands apart like someone who believes he has the power to calm the world or soothe agitated waters. "John, you're old enough by now to understand that the truth, the unvarnished truth, is the best medicine for what ails you. But don't just take my word for it. Earlier this evening, I happened upon someone else's thoughts on your work." He holds up a magazine. "Blackwood's, a respectable publication, is it not?" "It's a Tory publication that thinks poetry should be the plaything of nobility," I reply. Abbey opens the magazine and reads with evident pleasure. "It is a better and wiser thing to be a starved apothecary than a starved poet. So back to the shop, Mr. John, back to the plasters, pills, and ointment boxes, but be a little more sparing of soporifics in your practice than you have been in your poetry." He sits back and cracks his knuckles, and that's alluding to the fact that John Keats had trained to be a physician's assistant. Tilting my head, I detect the soft footfall of steps behind the door to the stairs. "Well," Abbey asks, "have you nothing to say for yourself?" I don't bite. "Really," Abbey prods, "no reaction at all." I cross my arms. I am a more severe critic of my own works than anyone else could ever be. "Do you intend to continue your career as a poet?" He purrs. I nod. "And what are your expectations, may I ask?" "That I shall be among the English poets after my death." Abbey lets out a long and jagged laugh that ends with a burst of gas like someone choking on a piece of beef. "Simply astonishing," he exclaims. "Surely you are the only person in the world who could possibly believe such an absurdity." Mock me as you wish, Mr. Abbey. I have no doubt there is good reason to do so, but I have come on other business. A smirk flashes across his face. Very well, proceed. I take a deep breath. Mr. Abbey, this is a matter of grave concern. Tom is ill. His condition is serious. I would like to secure your permission for Fanny to visit him. I test an entreating look. Abby's mouth sets primly. Shall I recall for you what happened when I allowed a visit last spring? It was a perfectly good visit. Abby shakes his head. It was no such thing. What was wrong? You introduced your innocent young sister to the society of some highly unsavory men. Fanny told us all about it herself, in great detail. The voice is smug and accusatory. She said the men took shocking liberties with her. The door to the staircase bursts open, and Fanny stands before us. I said no such thing, she declares. Splotches of red stain her face. Abby turns his astonished spectacles toward the girl. Fanny, I caution her. It's a lie, she insists. It's all a lie. Everything he says is a lie. Young lady, you were ordered to go to your room. Abby brandishes a bony finger toward the upstairs. Fanny crosses her arms and refuses to move. Every ounce of my being wants to take her side, but what good can that do? I imagine the consequences if she carries her rebellion any further. Fanny, do as Mr. Abbey says, please, I implore her. She casts a withering look in my direction, throws her arms up in the air, and stomps up the stairs. Some brother you are, echoes her voice from the stairwell. And that's as far as I'll read. Tough times for the family. Now, I wanted to talk just a little bit about, oh, we got time, good, about the Nightingale. And the Nightingale did take shape as a voice of naivete, a voice not understanding humans, learning words. Somehow in the book explains how that transformation happens from bird to spirit. Learning words, realizing that words have cruel edges to them, and trying to understand the whole range of human emotions. And this is just one passage where it's trying to understand regret, which he knows John Keats is feeling. Let's see here. This is now the Nightingale. I could now recognize one type of pain that the poet felt, regret. He regretted many of his past actions, in particular his dealings with his sister and brothers. Birds sometimes experience something similar. There was a robin I once observed on a summer day so perfect it was easy to forget that danger never shuts its eyes. Flying off in search of food for her children, she spied a pool of water on the ground and fluttered onto a nearby rock. After a few quick glances around her, she hopped into the pool and began to clean herself, dipping her wings in the water and shaking them in the warmth of the sun. But in the short time she took to groom herself, a squirrel crept down from the highest branches of her oak tree, silent and deadly, and approached her nest of fledglings. From my perch in the plum tree, I chirped, whistled, and buzzed to warn her of the danger. She must have thought it nothing but typical nightingale chatter. She dipped her wings again and shook herself dry, then repeated the process 2 more times. I shot off through the mild summer air directly toward the oak tree and swished by the squirrel in warning, distant enough to avoid its brutal claws, but close enough to see the murderous glint in its eyes. My warning flight only caused the villain to redouble the speed of its approach. By now the mother had completed her bath and lifted herself into the air to ride the gentle wind currents back home. She glided up to the nest, rose above it, and beat her wings furiously. A squawk, several harsher squawks, a series of shrieks, the flurry of attack. The squirrel scurried to the end of a branch, leaped across the void to a maple tree, and scrambled off into the greenery. The mother returned to her nest, and there followed a series of stricken cries. What I felt then was regret. If not for my warning flight, which quickened the arrival of the squirrel, the mother robin might have returned in time to save a fledgling or 2. Has the word been invented for the loss she felt then? Her mate returned, and they mourned together. It was a pain too great to bear alone. And then she goes on to human pain. And one last bit of reading. I want to read a little bit about Fanny Brawne and Keats. Let's see. There's a lot of back and forth in their relationship. Some of it had to do with the fact that John Keats was known to be impoverished, and Fanny's mother did not want her to see John Keats because, and we can blame her for that, but times were tough for women then. We know that. They could barely own anything themselves. They needed to marry a gentleman of substance or something. You know, it was, I mean, the whole system was tough, not that it's always easy today either. But then at one point it looked as if Keats was inheriting a fair amount of money after Tom died, and Keats sort of alludes to that, to Fanny's mother. Anyway, he gets invited to spend Christmas Day with him, and it's sort of one of their first perfect moments together. I just want to read a little bit of that dialogue. And they've had a bunch of, you know, things happening Christmas Day, and dinner's over, and the family's leaving them to sit on the sofa by the fire. "I hope my family has not alarmed you," she offers, sipping at a cup of tea. "Your family is wonderful." She places her cup down on the side table. "I was rude to you a few weeks ago," she says. "I was distant and unsympathetic." "You were." I turn toward her. Her eyes are ardent and clear. "If it helps at all, it was not really my doing," she explains. "My mother had told me I was being too forward with you." Her mouth twists. "She said I was throwing myself at you." "I never felt that." I lift my hand, pause, and place it on hers. She allows my hand to remain there. "She warned me against you and told me to keep my distance, which is why I was so dreadful to you on that night. I hated myself for it." I was puzzled by it. She squeezes my hand. "Then later that evening, Mother said she had been talking to Mrs. Dilks, and for some reason she changed her mind about you. She said it would be all right to invite you over for Christmas if I wanted that, which of course I did. Thank God for the Dilkses. I have no idea why she changed her mind, but I do know that my mother fears for my future. It hasn't been easy for her, losing father, having to raise the three of us on her own. And she thinks I should be set up for life with a man of wealth." Her lip curls just slightly. "Not a bad wish, certainly," I observe. Her eyes flash. "And what do you mean by that?" She draws her hand away, and it goes on. But anyway, it ends up in the scene that, you know, they're kissing, they're all good. And the little sister, Margaret, Fanny's little sister, discovers him and lets out a scream. And the Nightingale sees this reenactment of this scene and writes, "How could I not rejoice at this turn of events? The poet loved deeply and was loved in return. Their love was in balance." And then Keats comes in. "Our love is out of balance. Out of balance. When we are together, it is as close to ecstasy as we mortals are granted. But each time we part, I feel torn in two." And he goes on and say, "After being away from her a few days, I notice an odd change, like the partial healing of a wound or the icing over of a lake. I am still dazzled by her. I am still at her mercy. But as I start to separate from her, I begin to shy away. I fear her power over me." And then it goes on like that. So a troubled relationship, but one that almost ends happily. Of course, Keats then becomes too ill with consumption to go on. But I would love to take a few questions now. I see from the sign in the back that we have a good 8 or 10 minutes. So please, any questions, I would love to answer them or try to answer them, including any questions you might have about how is it different writing about Keats and Emily Dickinson, because that's an interesting one. Yes, sir.
This is not exactly a question.
Okay.
There's a wonderful essay written by Ronald Trilling about Keats. It's called "The Poet as a Hero," Keats and His Letters. It's written in the 1950s. If somebody can get hold of it, it's a lovely essay. It discusses Keats as a human being. And it's a great deal of insight going through his letters. And the other point he makes, though, is that Keats did not have an unhappy life. He had very close friends. He was very genial. He had publishing that believed in him. So it isn't all just bitterness.
That's right. He did have close friends, some of whom, though, like Benjamin Hayden, were trying to get money from Keats and were treating him not greatly. But Charles Brown was a great friend, and he had real love with Fanny. But you can see, and Lionel Trilling, great critic, and I really look forward to reading that. And Poet as a Hero is a good way to put it. But you can see in the letters the huge swings of emotion, too. But I really believe they would have ended up poverty and sickness was just overwhelming, despite the fact that Keats, I think, had a very kind and good disposition in general, and definitely was the sort of person who made friends. One of the earliest historical memories of Keats is that he was at school. By luck, he ended up at a very good school, Enfield, and had a good older headmaster who believed in him, and the headmaster's son also was a teacher who believed in him. They treated him very well. Keats's younger brother came, and an usher who was an assistant teacher, like on the first day of school, hit him for some apparent discretion, maybe talking back. And this guy was big, and Keats, little John Keats, who wasn't even 5 feet, went up and challenged him to a fist fight. You know, and this was a poet as hero. There you have it, sir. That's exactly right. Okay. Any other questions or comments? Oh, you're not raising your hand. You're saying we have 5 minutes. Okay. So if you have a question that can be answered in 5 minutes or less, I'll be glad to take it. Yes, Barbara. Sorry.
I was just going to say, I think you want us to ask you, how is it different writing about Emily?
Well, thank you. That's a brilliant question, and it is. What I see about Emily Dickinson is writing about her as the three great mysteries of her life, which, of course, her reclusiveness, and then when she almost lost her vision, and also the love letters or love paragraphs she wrote, and trying to describe that in a way that opens a new light on Emily Dickinson. So I told it from a narrator within a narrator of a slightly eccentric uncle who came up with a crazy theory about her, but I think, opened some doors on Emily Dickinson. Stylistically, Emily Dickinson, they're both incredibly powerful and wonderful poets. Emily Dickinson is more spare and yet startlingly original, more elliptical in her style. Keats is more sensuous, in some ways more direct, but just as deep. So I tried in writing about Emily Dickinson, I wasn't writing about nothing after life or anything, I was writing about her life, but I tried there truly to pare down my style to match more of her style. So when her letters and poems come in, it's more of a match. With Keats, I felt I could go more off. He wrote about some really out there subjects, so I felt I could do something like have a narrator be a Nightingale, and to go off in more sort of sensuous and wild directions in terms of that sort of aesthetic. So that, in a nutshell, that's sort of the difference that I would see between writing them. They were both incredible poets to spend time with. Just a wonderful blessing to spend time with both. Georgia, yeah.
Why do you think? Why was it that Keats was not able to connect with Wordsworth?
Okay, so it was complicated. Wordsworth was 30 years older. Keats loved his great poems, like Tintern Abbey. And he got introduced to him once or twice, and then they went to what was termed the Immortal Dinner. It was thrown by Benjamin Haydon, the painter. He invited Wordsworth, Keats, and 4 other people, some relatives. And at that, something went wrong at that dinner. And what we do know is that Wordsworth, a great poet, wrote most of his great poetry, maybe earlier in life, but still a great poet, but he was not making a lot of money. He got a job, it was given to him as a kind of favor to be I can't remember what it was called, like a postmaster, something or other. He didn't do the work, but he had the title. And the person who funded it had a certain title, and he wanted to meet Wordsworth, and he showed up sort of unannounced at this party halfway through. And Keats and his friends started making fun of him because he sat there so rigid and was, and then he tried to appear profound, and he announced to the party, who had just come back from a lot of food and drinking, sitting in the room, and he announced, "Sir, don't you think that Milton was a great poet?" And all these, poets and other who knew that Milton was a great poet collapsed on the floor laughing because they thought it was such an obvious question to ask. And so this man was offended. He left the party. Wordsworth ran after him, finding out who it was at first. First, Wordsworth didn't know. This was the guy who basically gave him his meal ticket. And so Keats was one of the ones laughing. So I think that's part of what happened. Keats did try to visit Wordsworth a few days later, and Wordsworth was getting all dressed up and was going to see that man and didn't want to see Keats. So, and they ran into each other once more in a walk somewhere near Hampstead, which was where Keats was living, and had a quick talk, but not much. So it sort of fell to pieces, and by the time John Keats got up to the Lake District to meet Wordsworth, Wordsworth was out doing political talks in favor of a very, very, very wealthy and conservative candidate who was one of the people who was part of his funding again. So I think sounds like modern America, doesn't it? But people on different sides of the political spectrum at that point. And Keats was, impoverished and was from a different viewpoint. And the book maybe doesn't treat Wordsworth quite as kindly as it might. I love William Wordsworth poetry. I think he's astonishing. But seen through John Keats's eyes, William Wordsworth was not necessarily the person he'd expected him to be. And there's one quote in Keats's letters where he talks about Wordsworth talking with people and then saying, well, he's the sort of person who gets angry when people don't disagree. When he gets angry with people when they don't agree with him, he puts his hands in his pockets and leaves. And that's from one of his letters. And Wordsworth did indeed leave from London unannounced one time in a fit of anger. So that's the short story about it. But Wordsworth is a great poet. I mean, as is Keats, of course. Yes, Mary.
Also, probably the final question.
Yeah.
What drew you to poetry of all the genres of writing? What drew you, when I say the poet's heart, what drew you to poetry?
I think it's the condensation of intense experience in even a few words that means an intense experience of living as well. So I think that's what drew me to it, was the intensity of it and the way it's so much expressing one person's viewpoint. I alluded to that at the opening night, something similar to that in talking about Sonia's winning essay, where I said, I probably won't be able to quote myself now, but sometimes when we have intense experiences in life, the daily objects of life transform themselves into symbols that embody in an organic way the emotions and the lessons that we undergo. And that's what I saw in her essay, that, that bowl turns into her love for her mother. And that's what I see poets doing, living so intensely that life, words, and symbols become united. I guess that would be the way to put it. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. It was a real pleasure talking to you.